You look a little tired. That maybe you didn't sleep real well last night. Everybody okay? We tried to rock you to sleep and everything. That didn't work either. Well, good morning. Welcome to the Oslo Lounge this morning. It's Saga Theater. For those of you that are watching back, I didn't sleep well either. You're right. No. Welcome to Saga Theater. For those of you that are watching back in your cabin TV, welcome also. It's being broadcast on Cabin TV Channel 5, as most of the lectures will be. We are very fortunate here on this particular Pacific Passage to have a number of lectures that we're going to be enjoying to enhance your cruise. And this morning is the beginning lecture of a gentleman who has a series of lectures you're going to find most fascinating. Historically, he was involved in this particular area of the world. He was the captain of the USS Triton, the submarine that went around the world in 84 days under the sea. And, of course, most notably, he was the author of Run Silent, Run Deep. Ladies and gentlemen, won't you please welcome Captain Edward L. Beach.
Me on this thing.
There you go.
Good, thank you. Good morning. Is this sound coming through clearly? First, I must say, at my wife's direction, that this is not a lecture with lots of slides. Do not be fooled by what the skull told you. I have a couple of slides which I'm going to show for a particular reason at a particular point in this lecture, but most of it is going to be me trying to tell you what just went on a few years ago out here. We'll be passing Wake Island in a few days. These are very historic waters for the United States Navy. Wake Island was one of the primary points of World War II. And yet one wonders, what was so important about it? Why? Why was Wake Island important? We're going to go by it. We're not even going to bother to stop and look at it. This was the biggest war the United States has ever fought in. It was by far the biggest war of our Navy. It was the one our Navy was built for, and it determined the shape of the world to come. It brought out passions that I don't think has ever existed in any previous war, and atrocities of all sorts, created probably more national heroes than any other conflict. And yet, what was Wake Island? What effect did it have on the war? Why do we remember it, and why do I feel that it was significantly important? Well, first, perhaps I should now show you my slides. If you will provide me with slide number 1, please, which is here principally orientation. This is the Pacific Ocean, which is a very poor slide, but anyway, here is Pearl Harbor. Here is Midway. Here is Wake. No, here is Wake, and here is Marcus Island. Marcus, Wake, Midway, Pearl Harbor. Well, I know you all want to see Wake Island, so let's get a look at it. I can make this thing go in the correct direction. There's Wake Island. One of the most important islands in the Pacific of its own particular kind. A sand spit, maybe 10 feet above the water level. It had a pier here, Pan American Clipper. A few PBYs are anchored out there. Here was a little settlement with Pan American Hotel. That's all there was. I have another shot just to show you that there isn't much more. Wake Island, Pan American Hotel. That's it. Now, why was this little sand spit important? Perhaps we ought to look at the history of Japan a little bit. Japan Oriental nation had a certain sort of fatalism. They disregarded human life. You recall in the Skull there was a description of the Kublai Khan when he threatened Japan back in 1274. He sent some ambassadors over to tell them, look, I'm about to attack you unless you guys want to surrender early and make it easy. And Japan sent the ambassadors back in a basket. This is a way of declaring that there's no way you can make a deal. And Kublai Khan got the message, and of course you know the story, and he failed because of what the Japanese have since referred to as the divine wind. The divine wind that twice destroyed his fleet. So Japan was a sacred nation. Japan's atrocities were legitimate. Russian-Japanese war came. No reason to declare war. Let's just attack while we have an advantage. They did. War with China, same thing. Attack without warning. We should have seen Pearl Harbor coming again without warning. Civilians that happened to be standing in the way of bombs were just out of luck. Too bad, but you know, they shouldn't have been there where the bombs were dropping or the bullets were falling or anything of that nature. And so along came the 7th of December, Pearl Harbor, and the 11th of December, 4 days later, a carefully pre-planned attack, obviously, attacked both Guam and the Wake Island. Now, by the Naval Conference of 1921, we had been granted Wake Island, also Guam. Japan had been given many of the islands in the Marianas and in the farther down in the Truk Island group. The German mandates were turned over basically to Japan. Incidentally, this is one reason why Japan joined World War I. She just took over these islands. We got Guam, Japan got Saipan just to the north. England and France had some islands too, and all of these islands were to be not fortified, simply mandated to be administered by the countries involved. Japan, however, immediately began to fortify Truk and built it into a bastion that even today we don't realize how good it was. It was the equivalent of Pearl Harbor. Truk Island, a super strong base down in the central South Pacific. We did not violate our engagement. Neither did the other nations. Wake Island was not fortified, neither was Guam. But late in 1941, realizing the situation was getting pretty serious, we did begin to build up the defenses of Wake. We realized that Guam was too far out and nothing we could do about Guam. At Wake we did. We sent 450 Marines. We sent 1,000 civilian construction workers. And on the 4th of December, we flew in 12 fighter planes from the carrier Enterprise that were sent out there for the purpose. Well, now, you all will remember the story of Amelia Earhart, lost on her round-the-world journey. No one knows what became of her. Been research ever since. It's now believed, with quite a bit of substantiation, that she ran out of fuel and crash-landed in the sea, was picked up by the Japanese, brought to Saipan, or Truk, or both, and simply allowed to die there of dysentery, no medical care. They didn't kill her, they simply just let her die. And her navigator, I think, was beheaded. All this is guesswork, but that's what we believe probably happened. Now, as you recall, we searched for Amelia Earhart quite extensively over that entire area of the Pacific, never found any trace. In 1941, we decided the situation has gotten bad enough, we better reinforce Wake, and we did. On the 11th of December, Wake was attacked. It was attacked by a fleet of Japanese ships and landing craft, all carefully prepared. Obviously, they didn't come from nowhere. These ships all came in, and the Marines, with some naval people there as well, behaved very, very well. They were smart. They had their guns all concealed. They had, I think it was 4 5-inch guns. But they had them well concealed. And the Japanese fleet got in quite close, and all of a sudden the guns opened up. They were all at point-blank range, in effect. 2 destroyers were sunk, 2 cruisers, large cruisers, badly damaged, and 2 more destroyers badly damaged. The landing craft never even got close, and the entire attack was repulsed. This was the first small victory after the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor. It made us stand a little taller, but not much. The head of the defenses at Wake Island was Major James Devereaux. There was also a Navy commander there named Cunningham, I believe. But Devereaux was in charge of the Marines. He is supposed to have said, "Send us more Japs." Well, that was a phony. He said no such thing. What he probably said was, "Well, can't you figure out some way to get these Japs off my back?" But we failed rather dismally. Admiral Kimmel, in charge of Pearl Harbor, had not yet been relieved, and he was a fighting man. He got up a relief expedition to attack, or rather to relieve Wake. 3 aircraft carriers were sent out there under the command of Admiral Fletcher. They got within 600 miles. They delayed to refuel, which I think was a mistake. They should have gone on. But in the meantime, Washington took hand and ordered Admiral Kimmel relieved of his post. Admiral Nimitz was due in. Admiral Nimitz had already been designated and was flying over, but he hadn't yet come even close to arriving. The Pacific Fleet commander was summarily dismissed, and his number 2 man, Admiral Pye, William S. Pye, was naturally succeeded to command. Well, for all the criticism that you want to make of Admiral Kimmel, I think he was mistreated by history. The fact is that he was trying to relieve Wake Island, but Admiral Pye, his successor, didn't have the nerve nor the understanding of what was going on. And he, after dithering around for about 24 hours, ordered that fleet to turn around and come back. So the carrier fleet that we had sent to relieve Wake, which had lots of airplanes that could have fought off the Japanese and done a much better job, or if anything else, have evacuated the Marines and Navy and civilian construction workers, they left, leaving the Marines and everybody else on Wake Island to their fate. I suppose you could say that we depended upon the Geneva Conventions. They would be treated as prisoners of war. Well, on the 22nd of December, the Japanese attacked the second time. This time they knew what the Marines had. They knew where the guns were. They knocked out all the guns. They blasted up the 12 airplanes that were there. Finally, they landed. There was no ammunition left. Major Devereaux surrendered his command, spent the rest of the war in prison camp with the surviving Marines. However, the 1,000 civilian construction workers, according to the Japanese, had violated the laws of war in that they had taken arms in their own defense. If you're a civilian in the war zone, according to their interpretation, you have to stand there and let the bombs fall on you and kill you if you haven't got a right to shoot back. These 1,000 construction workers were driven out into the water and beheaded. All of them. Now that part of the story has not been very well made known to the United States public for several reasons. One was that we detected it by decoding Japanese messages, so we weren't going to reveal the fact that we knew this. Secondly, we didn't at the time know how to handle it. But we did one thing. This was what created the Seabees. All civilian construction workers from that point on who were in the war zone were made military people. They discovered that the raised blade of a bulldozer was an excellent anti-personnel weapon. And they had great delight in driving those bulldozers over any Japanese emplacements that they found. I've seen photographs of it. I've never seen it myself. But when you're driving a bulldozer with a great big blade right over a trench, you have a pretty strong effect on whatever is inside that trench. They were skilled at that, and they gloried in from there on. But the point to remember is this is what created the Seabees. From now on, no civilian construction workers of any sort in our cross-Pacific march. Well, so what happened then? Essentially nothing. Essentially nothing. Wake Island was captured by the Japanese, and we simply left it there. We did not attack it to recapture it, but we had a different form of revenge. And remember, this was a war attitude. We feel differently about the Japanese today, but in those days that I'm talking about, and there are many people here who feel the same way as I did then, we had a rather passionate feeling for Wake Island, for the other Japanese, and the conquests. Wake was never re-invaded. Wake was simply used as a training base for our side. And we permitted the Japanese to resupply it. We didn't stop the resupply. We wanted them to resupply it because that was where our new carriers and our new attack forces got a chance to get some training against active opposition. The Japanese never realized that that's what we were using Wake Island for. When the war came to an end, we had yet to recapture Wake, and you will look in vain in history books to find out how we got it back. Well, the fact is, after the war, after the surrender, we simply sent a message and said, we're coming ashore to take over. And the Japanese commander on Wake Island was required to surrender. We took his samurai sword from him, threw him in prison camp. We investigated to be sure we had the right man, discovered that we did. He was tried and hanged for his action at Wake Island. And in my opinion, that he richly deserved it too. Major Devereaux became a prisoner, got a Medal of Honor, later became a member of Congress. And the next time Wake Island figured in history was when President Truman and General MacArthur had their famous conference on that island, which is a totally different story. Now, you could say, well, what is that in the terms of history? Well, let me just give you a quick rundown on what was happening in the Pacific at that time. Wake Island, as I showed you on the map, is almost straight across the Pacific from Pearl Harbor. The very first thing we did after Pearl Harbor and after Wake was the Tokyo raid. Tokyo raid was in April 1942, April 18th. We sent two carriers, actually from Alameda, Alameda, California, loaded with B-26s out to attack Japan, and on the 18th, they actually attacked Japan. They raced back from that action. The planes, of course, went across and landed in China and Russia. The carriers raced back from that action, and Admiral Nimitz had by this time already discovered that there was an attack going to the south, and that the target might very well be Australia. In those days, we didn't know for sure, but Australia probably was the target. He sent those two carriers south at full speed to join the two that were already there, and the next thing was the Battle of the Coral Sea between New Guinea and Australia. That happened on the 8th of May, 3 weeks after the raid on Pearl Harbor. And we now discover that the raid on Pearl Harbor was one of the things that caused the Japanese to withdraw from the Indian Ocean and concentrate on drive to the south to threaten Australia and also to threaten our Pacific Fleet, which they realized was still powerful. So what was the next thing? That was the 8th of May. On the 3rd of June was the attack on Midway. So the sequence of events in the Pacific at that time were crucial to the history of the war. Of course, the attack on Pearl Harbor, which started it all, the Wake Island campaign, the attack on Guam, but then principally the raid on Tokyo, followed by the Coral Sea battle, followed by Midway, and that is where the war changed direction. Midway was only 8 months or so, 7 months after Pearl Harbor, and we changed the direction of the war right then. I'm going to have a lot more to say about that in future lectures, but I just want to point out that as the history of this area is developed, this was the significant part of the war. Of course, I'm a naval officer, and I'm talking about it from the Navy point of view. And there may be some people here who think that there's more to the attack from the Southwest Pacific under General MacArthur than I am giving him credit for. But the Navy that drove across the Pacific Ocean, that island hopped from island to island, that attacked Iwo Jima and captured it after a tremendous battle, that attacked Okinawa and made it into a major staging base, and that was going to lead the attack and the landing on Japan when finally the war was brought to an end. So these waters are extraordinarily historic. They were what our Navy was built for. We accomplished that mission. And of course now we here in this room and on this ship are merely witnesses to where it all was. And all you can see is calm seas, nice water, a few seagulls flying around or albatross. And remember only that here is where history was made, at sea, in ships like this. I'll be happy to answer any questions or discuss the thing more fully if you wish. Yes, ma'am. Oh, I should recall that. It's something like half a mile by 2 miles. It's very small. This actually is Wake Island, but that was Peel Island that we saw. I think there's another even smaller island. Yes, sir. I hadn't scheduled the Coral Sea, but I can if people are interested, or I'll do it informally to anyone that wants to talk about it because I've got slides on it. Were you there? Well, there's a lot. Yes. I haven't seen it in recent years, but I would describe it as being even less than what you see here now. There is no need for the hotel any longer. The planes fly right over it. Yes, sir. Personally, I believe it might have been, or if not avoided, our defense would have been far better set up. We had broken the code. The information was being sent to Washington, D.C. It was received there by the intelligence group in Washington, who massaged it and put everything together and then sent the information out to the fleet commanders. This information was inaccurate. It told Kimmel, and Short too, General Short, that that there was probably going to be an attack by Japan, and that the attack probably would be in the Far Eastern area, and that they should be alert for things like sabotage. They did not report, they didn't evaluate correctly that there was a fleet coming in to attack and make a major attack on Pearl Harbor, which now, as we go over those dispatches, we now see it was clearly in. Now, this is why I'm getting ahead of myself because I want to discuss this about the Battle of Midway, but this is why Admiral Nimitz was so successful at Midway, because he discovered through an underground circuit of his own, his intelligence officer, Commander Layton, was a very good friend of Commander Joe Rochefort, who was in charge of the decoding in Pearl Harbor Navy Yard. But Rochefort was responsible for the people in Washington. And so Nimitz gave an adamant order to the effect that you do what your duty requires you to do. But if you discover anything at all that has anything to do with me and my fleet and my responsibilities, I want to know it right now. I don't care what else you do with it, but I want to know it right now, or I'll have you, strung up to the highest yarder. Well, this was an easy order to give, but even easier to carry out, because Rochefort and Leighton were good friends, and they wanted that order. In fact, I think it was they who sort of suggested it to Nimitz. But the result was that Rochefort was reporting to Washington, and Washington evaluated that the attack on Midway was going to be not on Midway, but on Johnson Island, and was going to be on the 20th of June. Can you imagine where Nimitz would have been? The 20th of June, on the 3rd of June, if he thought it was going to be the 20th. He had all of his forces in the South Pacific, all of his carriers, except one, the Saratoga, damaged. She was in overhaul. He had lost one, the Lexington, in the Coral Sea battle. Nothing in the Pearl Harbor area, nothing in the Midway area. We had them all come back at full speed. The damaged Yorktown running just as fast as she could. The other two weren't damaged, but the Yorktown was badly damaged. The overhaul for the Yorktown was scheduled to take 3 months, and they did it in 3 days. She wasn't overhauled. She was simply repaired, made actionable. And they sent her out into the area, and that resulted in the Battle of Midway. Sir. Oh, yes, that, I'm sorry, I should have done that. The previous question was, did we have the decoding information about Pearl Harbor, and would the thing have come out differently had we had it? And that was my answer. But thank you for reminding me. Yes, sir. Is there any substance to the report that a radio operator heard the Japanese were coming that morning and reported to the higher ups? That there is such a report and has substance, but not quite the way you've stated it. It was a radar operator, not radio, but radar, and he detected. Well, first, let me say that they didn't have enough people to run the radar 24 hours a day, and he was due to go off duty at about, I think it was 6 o'clock in the morning. However, this radar was a brand new toy, and he was fascinated with it, and he kept fiddling with it for a little while after he was due to be relieved, due to turn it off. So at about 6:30 or thereabouts, somewhere in that time period, he detected a flight of planes coming in, which he reported to his superior. He said, "Here's a flight of planes. It's not on the schedule, and I'm supposed to turn the thing off, but anyway, that's what I found out here." And the superior officer, whose name I believe was named Clark, but anyway, this was an Army captain, said, "Well, don't worry about it. It's probably that flight of B-17s that's due in sometime." Well, the flight of B-17s, I think, was not due in for a couple of days. But at any rate, he took the easy way out of it and just put it aside. And of course, the attack came about an hour later. So that is the truth of that story. Now, there's another story of a somewhat similar nature, that a radio operator on some merchant ship actually saw some carriers out in the Atlantic Ocean and radioed in about them, and that this was also ignored. But that has not ever been able to be proved to be true, and I rather suspect it is not true. One way. During World War II, I was a submarine officer. The question is, did I operate a patrol in the Pacific myself? And the answer is yes, indeed. I was a submarine officer. I was in the war from the beginning and served throughout the war, and I made 12 submarine war patrols. And to permit a little bragging, I think I participated in sinking 26 ships and damaging about 18. Incidentally, a story about that. There was a story of a submarine which waited outside of Tokyo Bay for 30 days while they built an aircraft carrier, and then as it slid down the ways, torpedoed it. Well, that was my sub. The story is not quite that good, but it's still pretty good. The story is that the carrier had already been built. She was on a maiden trial cruise. And as she stuck her nose outside of Tokyo Bay, just where we were lying there in wait, And now we can admit that it was an ultra message that put us there. It was a decoded message that said, you wait on this spot, this carrier is coming by. And he came by right on time, and we nailed him. And we hit him with, well, we heard 4 torpedoes explode, and he didn't sink. We got the devil depth charge out of us. Severely damaged, but not sunk, obviously. And got back and discovered that the carrier had gone back under tow to Pearl Harbor, to Tokyo Bay, where they had to beach her on a sandbar to keep her from sinking. And it took another 1.5 years to get her back in commission. So that was a carrier that slid down the ways and sank in the harbor. After the war, I told this story, wrote it up and was published. And I got a letter from a Japanese naval officer who said he had been chief of staff aboard the carrier when this happened. And here's what happened from his point of view. And he wrote me a very detailed letter describing everything that went on, and said that although they had been scheduled to go through this particular point, the admiral had decided not to, so they were going to go on the other side of the island of Oshima, which is right there at the entrance. But as they were coming down the island, for some reason the admiral changed his mind, and they went between 2 of the islands and got back on their basic course, which is where we were waiting. And he said that was our big mistake, but we didn't know about that. And then he said, suddenly the lookout hollered. We've corresponded, and recently I learned he died. But he was a great fellow, and once the war thing is over, you can really admire and respect those people. He was a very fine professional naval officer. But I'm still glad we torpedoed him. Yes, sir. How many submarines did we have in service during different phases of the war? We began the war with 52. During the war, we lost 52. At the end of the war, we had, I think, 270 in service. And at no time did we have more than about 3,000 men at sea in the submarines. There were 30,000 men, roughly, in submarine duty, and of these, only 15,000 ever went to sea in a submarine. We sank 2/3 of the Japanese merchant marine and 1/3 of its navy. I might also point out, though, that at the beginning of the war, and I'm going to talk about this perhaps the day after tomorrow, the submarine torpedoes that we had were atrociously bad. The result was that during the invasion of the Philippines, we had a very good submarine force. We had 29 submarines attached to the Asiatic fleet. 1 ship was sunk of the invasion, just 1. The Germans, at the beginning of World War II, happened to have 39 submarines in their whole effective submarine force. They later built up 1,000, but they only had 39 active submarines. These 39 submarines raised hell with England from the first day. What do you think the results would have been if the German submarine force had been on our side 2 years later, even just those 39, instead of our 29? If they had been fighting on our side in the Asiatic fleet during the invasion of the Philippines. Well, this is an unpopular subject in the U.S. Navy and the U.S. submarine force because of the disaster of the torpedoes. But I believe that the invasion would have been a failure. We'd have sunk many ships. The Philippine Islands would have been defended. The Bataan Death March would not have happened. MacArthur would not have had to evacuate. 3 million Filipinos would not have died. And that's the cost we paid for those lousy torpedoes. Yes, sir. Did we ever develop a torpedo comparable to the, what they call it, the long knife? I think they had a different name, but anyway, I know the one you're talking about. That was a Japanese torpedo powered by hydrogen peroxide, 24-inch diameter tube instead of ours, which are only 21, and carried, I think, 1,000 or 1,500 pound warhead. It would go 40 knots for 40,000 yards. Ours would go 45 knots for 3,000 yards. The difference was just phenomenal. Furthermore, they were weightless. because of hydrogen peroxide fuel, which did not produce a wake. They were also very dangerous to handle, but they had solved the problem. Now, we tried to make a hydrogen peroxide torpedo. We couldn't make it work. We never had it. We had experimental models. We never used it in the war. The result was that they were far superior to us in those torpedoes. Now, did we ever build one as good? In my opinion, we never did. Certainly not when it counted. We've got fancier, better ones now. This is 40 years later, too. Yes, sir. The question is, can I give you any background on Albany, Australia, where the submarine base? But I'm not sure that Albany was the base. There was submarines based at Brisbane and at Fremantle, which is the port city of Perth. And it was the base. We were there, and we were told there was. Well, I can answer one question right now, and there were not 50 submarines based there. There could not have been. We had something like 10 submarines based in Fremantle or Perth, and I think there were only maybe 20 based out of Brisbane. Perhaps that many, yes. Well, I'll look it up and come up with a better answer, but I can't tell you that right now. Yes, ma'am. The question relates to the tiny one-man submarine used by the Japanese. There were actually several different versions of small submarines, suicide-type submarines that the Japanese used. There was a two-man submarine which attacked at Pearl Harbor, and you've seen pictures of that. It had 2 torpedoes and a crew of 2. And of the 5 that attacked Pearl Harbor, all 5 were lost. They did no good, but 1 man survived. So the Japanese memorial shows only 9 pictures of 9 heroes, and the 10th guy was not a hero because he didn't die. However, he went to South America, where he became a big executive in Toyota Motor Car Company and is a millionaire today. The other kind of submarine that they built was, incidentally, the 2-man submarine with 2 torpedoes. Theoretically, could return from mission. It had only battery power and therefore no long range. But it was launched from the deck of a submarine and could theoretically return. None ever did. But they also invented a Kaiten, so-called Kaiten, which was a suicide torpedo, suicide submarine. It was one of the large long lance torpedo was the name. Large long lance torpedoes, enlarged with a central section where they had a man sitting. It could be released from a submarine, mounted on deck, released, and could travel some 40,000 yards in search of a target. In the early days of the war, the intent was that when we invaded Japan, these one-man submarines would come out and blow up all the invading ships from their shore bases. But later on, the Japanese developed a technique of using them at sea to attack cruising ships, not ships that were at anchor or just waiting were in motion themselves. And there's still a controversy. I happen to have strong opinions on this one. There's a controversy as to whether or not the Indianapolis was sunk by normal torpedoes or by Kaiten torpedoes. Japanese have claimed outright that it was sunk with a normal torpedo attack. I don't believe it. It was sunk by Kaitens. And the reason why I say that is because she was hit with 3 at a range of about 10,000 yards, some 3 or 4 minutes after the torpedoes were fired. I fired enough torpedoes to know that you don't hit a ship making 20 knots with 3 torpedoes at 10,000 yards 3 minutes after you shoot them. If you get in close enough, as we tried, you'll hit if you're aiming right. But if you're that far away, There's no way you can, especially not 2 or 3 minutes between torpedoes. And then the clincher is that the Japanese skipper claimed that a few days later he saw a ship on the horizon that he thought was probably a seaplane carrier. So he sent his Kaitans off after it. And they torpedoed it because he saw a big column of smoke. But our records show no ships damaged, sunk, or even threatened in that particular place. So I think what he had to do was to account for his Kaitans. So he made up a fictitious attack. But, you can't prove that. He denies it to this day, and I think he probably always will. Yes, sir. Well, I'll go into that a little bit more day after tomorrow. What is the story behind our defective torpedoes? But fundamentally, let me tell you what was wrong with them. There wasn't one thing wrong. There were 4 things wrong. One, they ran too deep. Secondly, they exploded prematurely because they had an electronic explosive thing, and they failed to realize that the Earth's magnetism in the far Pacific was greater than it was in Newport, where the thing was built. Therefore, it was much more sensitive than they knew, and it would explode before it passed under the target ship. So when they deactivated that, they found that the contact exploding mechanism didn't function. And the reason that didn't function is because the stupid designers had the firing pin going up like this when the torpedo hits like that. Well, you know what happens if you hit hard enough, you deform everything, and in the process you fix it with a firing pin that works in a direction vertical to the direction of motion of the torpedo and all the momentum in there. It's just not going to function. It'll bend, and that's what happened. So that was 3 of the things. And the 4th thing was that they didn't always run straight. Sometimes they ran in circles. And we know of 2 submarines that were lost from running in a circle, from torpedoes running in a circle. Their own torpedoes sank. There were 28 submarines lost with no account. No known account of why they were lost. There were 7 where we got survivors back, and of the 7, 2 were lost with their own torpedoes. So if 2/7 of our submarines were lost because of circular torpedoes, 2/7 of 28 is 8. And I think that may be a more accurate figure than 2. So we may have lost up to about 8 of our own submarines due to faulty torpedoes running in circles. I personally have experienced it 3 times. Twice they exploded prematurely. And once it didn't explode at all. Yes, sir. The question is whether what there was to the report of Japanese submarines lobbing shells at oil refineries on the coast during the War of California, and also about an air raid warning in Los Angeles. Well, there were reports. There was one instance of a Japanese submarine that surfaced off the coast of California and lobbed a few shells ashore. And this was shortly after Pearl Harbor, and not much damage was done, and nothing much came of it. We all read stories of the telephone lineman who was on the telephone pole, saw the submarine, plugged in his phone, called in, the bombers flew out and sank the sub. All of which is some more bonus balonus, because none of that ever happened. The sub did shell the coast, but it got clean away. The newspaper sank it. The report of shelling Los Angeles is just plain not true. There may have been a scare, and they may have gone ahead and run the air raid sirens, but so far as I know, there was just that one attack on the coast of California by Japanese submarine. Now remember the conditions of the time, though. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, we thought the Japanese were about to land in Hawaii and conquer the place and come and land in California. And we were in a state of some sort of hysteria out there. I know, I came home from submarine school and went home, and that's what I found when I got home on about the 20th of December, they were still expecting the Japanese landing. So let me just extend this one little bit more and ask you if you think Congress would have declared war on Germany because the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and were going to land in California. And the answer is, of course, Germany declared war on us, which is one of the stupidest things Hitler could have done. He declared war on us on the 11th of December, contrary to the advice of the German chiefs of staff, of the German high command. Had he not done so, I think Roosevelt would have had a lot of difficulty in getting a declaration of war through Congress against the Germans based upon Japanese attack. So that, as far as I'm concerned, totally demolishes the theory that Roosevelt connived at the attack on Pearl Harbor in order to get us into a war against Germany. He wanted us in a war in Europe, yes. He felt that was important, it was necessary. He did everything he could to get us in. But he could not have done it that way. The approximate date of the reported attack on the Pacific coast. No, but it was very, very early, like late December. There were one or two Japanese submarines that were sent to our coast to patrol, and they accomplished nothing. One of them came through the Aleutian area in about June of 1942, so it was as late as that, and it sank a submarine, which turned out to be a Russian submarine. And that didn't give anybody much credit. But anyway, that's the only thing that they accomplished. Will I be covering the Japanese aircraft carrying subs? I hadn't contemplated to do so. No, I'm not familiar with that action. The action off the northwest American coast. I didn't know there was any. I know they flew these balloons over to try to start forest fires. They came from the mainland of Japan. So far as Japanese, there may have been one. There was one. Yeah, but it didn't do any good, so it didn't really figure in history. If there's no further question, maybe we better call it a time. It's 11:20, and thank you very much for your attention. I'll be at you in a couple of days.